Steve Taylor is a senior lecturer in psychology, is the author of numerous best-selling books on psychology and spirituality, and writes articles for Scientific American and Psychology Today. Eckhart Tolle has described Steve's work as an important contribution to the shift in consciousness which is happening on our planet at present. His most recent book, DisConnected: The Roots of Human Cruelty and How Connection Can Heal the World, is much needed right now during these difficult times that we're facing, and I strongly encourage you to read it. As always, we've taken the time to create timestamps which can be found in the description below. So Steve, to start us off, can you tell me a little bit about your background and about your research interests, please?
My area of research is in transpersonal psychology, which is basically spiritual psychology. It's the study of spiritual experiences, of spiritual transformation, of spiritual traditions. So I've always been a spiritual person in my sort of personal life. I've always followed spiritual practices and spiritual paths and had spiritual experiences. So in my research, I try to study those that field, that area from an academic perspective. And I've written a number of books about those, about my research. And I'm also I'm a poet. I write spiritual poetry, which kind of stems from my own spiritual experiences.
Wow. Yeah, so have you said you've always been into like the spiritual side of things and open to these kind of things?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, even before I knew what spirituality was, I was probably, interested in spirituality. But it was only when I was a bit older, when I was probably in my early 20s, that I realized that there was a thing called spirituality and there was a thing called mysticism. Before then, I had sort of what I recognize now were probably spiritual experiences, but at the time I didn't understand them. Yeah, I thought there was maybe something wrong with me. I was maybe a bit crazy, but later on, a few years later, I thought, oh, well, maybe I'm not crazy after all. Other people have had these experiences, other people have studied these experiences, and so it was a great relief actually when I found that there was this thing called mysticism and this thing called spirituality. It gave me a kind of a framework to understand myself,
and realized you weren't going crazy.
Yeah.
And then at what point did you decide you wanted to go into the route of like teaching psychology or lecturing in psychology and working in those areas?
It was many years later actually, because at that time I was a musician and my main aim was just to avoid any kind of employment. And, I wanted to live on the fringes of society and just avoid kind of conventional life for as long as I could, which I managed to do for a long time until I was about 37. I decided to go back to university I mean, during that time, my other aim, besides being a musician, I wanted to be a writer. So I always wrote stories and poetry and novels. But by the time I was about 30, I thought, well, maybe I should bring together my interest in spirituality with my writing. So I began to write about spirituality and about psychology, and published a couple of books around that time. But when I was 37, I realized that, I became aware that there was a field called transpersonal psychology, which I'd never known about before. And I thought, when I heard about it, I thought, wow, this is me. This is where I belong. This is what I want to do. So I decided to go back to university to do a master's degree in transpersonal psychology, which led to a PhD, and which led to my position at my university now in my research.
Yeah. And you said transpersonal psychology is kind of spiritual psychology, right? So how would you define transpersonal psychology without, using the term spiritual psychology? What does it mean exactly? What is it?
Well, literally it means, transpersonal literally means beyond the self or beyond the ego. So it means the investigation of realms of consciousness or states of being that are beyond the ego.
Yeah.
So higher states of consciousness, they're sometimes called mystical experiences. But also, transpersonal psychology investigates, the transformational journey from what we could call a normal state of consciousness towards a more expansive state of consciousness. So investigates, how we can go about transforming ourselves, how we can go about expanding our awareness and connecting more powerfully to other people, to nature, to the whole cosmos.
Yeah. It does sound really interesting. It sounds fascinating. So I guess a part of the stuff you teach and the stuff that's involved is spiritual awakenings, and I guess meditation and all that kind of stuff plays its part.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, I also teach the psychology of well-being, positive psychology. What is human well-being? How can we cultivate well-being? But that's strongly connected with transpersonal psychology, because as soon as we go beyond the normal self or the normal human state of being, we move towards well-being. I think the normal state of the normal human state is one of discord and suffering. So we need to expand our awareness. We need to transcend our normal state in order to find well-being.
Fascinating. Today, I really want to talk about your most recent book in some detail. So I've got it here, DisConnected, the roots of human cruelty and how connection can heal the world. Sorry, I stumbled over my words there. DisConnected, the roots of human cruelty and how connection can heal the world, which, yeah, it's a fascinating read. I finished it really recently and I had about like 80 questions, I think, for you after reading it. So I've had to kind of narrow those down a little bit. But to start off, how and when did you decide to write that book? What was the motivation for that?
It wasn't really a conscious process. I often find that with books that they're not really. I don't really make a conscious decision to write a book. They sort of grow slowly over a number of years, and eventually they're ready to take form. I'm ready to enable them to take form, to start writing them. But it kind of grew over a number of years. I was writing articles about political issues, which I don't normally do, but I became interested in political issues maybe 5 or 6 years ago, maybe for observing the current political scene and connecting with psychology. Basically, I became aware of the link between pathology and politics, how many politicians are actually kind of psychologically disordered people, with a strong desire for power, a strong desire for dominance, for wealth, for fame and attention. With traits of like self-delusion and other malevolent traits, such as the desire to exploit and deceive people. So, that led me to start thinking about democracy and, what is wrong with our kind of democratic political systems and why it's so easy for those kind of people to take power. And it seems as though that's, not connected to spirituality at all. But, the way I see it is that when we look into the people who I call disconnected or hyper disconnected people, the kind of people I was just talking about who have a strong desire for power, who live in a state of narcissism and even have psychopathic traits, they're really the polar opposite of spiritual people. Spirituality is all about altruism and compassion and empathy, whereas disconnected people have the opposite of those traits. They are malevolent, they have no empathy. They live in a state of self-absorption and selfishness. So I really began to investigate the polar opposite of spirituality in order to try to. I think my main motivation was to try to understand human nature, because one of the interesting things about human beings is that we cover such a wide spectrum of behavior and character. We are, some human beings are psychopaths, some human beings are saints and mystics. And there's a lot of middle ground where most human beings are probably somewhere in the middle.
That always makes me think, just to quickly jump in, it always makes me think about how when somebody does something really bad, we kind of go, it's human nature, When somebody does something really good, human nature. It goes both ways.
Yeah, that's true. It's amazing, really, that human nature covers this incredibly wide spectrum. So I guess I wanted to understand that spectrum and to understand good and evil.
That's quite a way of saying it. You're right, though. We have it all on display here. So can you explain to people that are unaware what exactly you mean when you say connected and disconnected? Like, just to give a basis for kind of the bulk of this conversation, so people know what we're talking about.
When I use the term disconnected, it mainly means people. It mainly refers to people who completely lack empathy. They have no empathic connection to other people at all. Other human beings are simply objects to them because they can't sense their feelings or emotions. They can't sense suffering, the other people's suffering, because they're completely enclosed in themselves. They live in a state of extreme separation. That also means that they live in a state of separation to the world as well. So the world is a slightly unreal place to them. It's a kind of hazy, pale, shadowy place, which, and that's why one of the traits of disconnected people is self-delusion. Because the world's kind of unreal to them. So it's easy for them to convince themselves that what happens in the world is the same as what they want to happen, so that they can distort reality to fit their desires and their thoughts. And conversely, connected people, the main trait of connected people, as I use the term, is empathy. They have a strong empathic connection to other human beings, to other living beings, and to nature as a whole. So they, rather than living in separation, they live in a state of participation, in a state of shared experience with others.
And hyper disconnected and hyper connected would just be very extreme examples of those two things, right?
Yeah, I mean, hyper disconnected people, they often become hardcore criminals, violent criminals, even serial killers. You know, serial killers, the main trait of serial killers is that they have no sense of the value of other people's existence. Other people are literally just machines to them because they have no empathic connection. So that's what enables them to kill people in a sort of cold, calculated way. But hyper disconnected people, that they can also become politicians, unfortunately. You know, many leading politicians in the world have very strong psychopathic, narcissistic traits. And, you know, historically, so many political leaders have been, you know, psychopaths. You know, in the 20th century, you know, it was quite common for political leaders to be psychopathic around the world. So certainly in the late 20th century, when we look at, you know, the world as a whole, probably most governments in the world were led by people with psychopathic traits.
Yeah.
But also, you know, there's a strong connection between hyper disconnected people and the corporate world. A lot of people in high status corporate positions, HEOs or CEOs, also have psychopathic traits.
Yeah. Yeah, it does all make sense, you know, once after reading your book, and again, it just kind of seems logical. It's no surprise that we have so many bad people in politics and so many people that get high in the business world or get far in the business world. Incredibly difficult people, and you know, it's that classic cliche of the horrible boss and the boss that doesn't care. Because I suppose that happens as well in, not so much in big corporations and in politics, but just in your normal small company in a village. It's like the disconnected person is just going to rise to the top of that company and just sit there as the day manager every day and just.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it happens in like local councils. You know, a lot of people who feel impelled to become councillors. Malevolent people with these kind of traits. And in any sort of hierarchical organization, you know, whether it's a school or a university, whether it's a business. I mean, it obviously isn't always the case. I mean, there are some good people in high status positions, but there's certainly a strong probability. Certainly, these people are more highly represented in these high level positions than they are in the general population.
Yeah. This could be a difficult question to answer just because it's, you know, we're having a conversation rather than you writing it in the book. But what would you say are the roots of disconnection? Like, how did we end up like this, and where did this come from? You know, is this us?
Well, I believe that human beings are always fundamentally connected. You know, interconnection is our basic nature. It's the nature of the universe. Everything in the universe is interconnected. You know, there's a whole sort of philosophical background behind this, which I mentioned later in the book. It's based on a philosophy which I call panspiritism, my kind of personal philosophy, which is that everything in the world consists of spirit. Everything stems from spirit, and our own inner being is an influx of universal consciousness or universal spirit. So we're always connected. We can't be disconnected. But you know, at a fundamental level, at the level of our essential, deepest nature, we can't be disconnected. But at a mental level, we can experience disconnection. And a lot of human beings do. Like, I mean, as I said before, most human beings are probably somewhere in the middle between, you know, psychopathy and enlightenment. So I think there is a certain level of disconnection which is natural to human beings as we have presently evolved. You know, it's natural for human beings to feel that we are somebody who lives in our personal space, you know, enclosed within our own mental worlds, with the rest of the world out there on the other side of our brains, so our skulls. That's kind of a natural human experience. That's a kind of a moderate level of disconnection or separation. But the kind of people we've just been talking about, the hyper disconnected people, their level of disconnection is usually related to trauma. Most highly disconnected people have had traumatic childhood experiences. they've suffered abuse, they've suffered a lack of maternal or paternal attention or attachment during early childhood. So that's a common thread which lies, you can identify that with every serial killer, with every psychopathic politician. There's a very similar pattern of disturbed childhood experiences, as I say, deprivation, emotional deprivation, abuse, trauma. And there's a whole sort of psychological process which takes place there where people protect themselves from trauma by closing themselves down to empathy and to emotion. It's a kind of protective mechanism. They shut themselves down, and in doing so, they lose the capacity to empathize with others. Obviously, that doesn't happen with everybody, but in some, certainly in many cases, that's what occurs.
Yeah. And then if they continue on that path, as you kind of explain in your book, like the callus above that just becomes harder and harder. And so it becomes harder to break away from that and to reconnect. And so they just keep doubling down and getting more and more disconnected, and seeing that helps them to advance as well in their own goals and their own ambitions in chasing, that power, money, status, wealth, and everything. Do you think some hyper disconnected people that have like disorders of disconnection, as you put it, like psychopathy and narcissism and things like that, are some people gonna like forced to remain disconnected due to factors outside of their control, like mental illness? For some people, is it impossible for them to connect, do you think? And obviously I'm talking probably about a very small minority right now, but do you think there are people like that out there that due to, like I say, medical reasons or whatever, factors outside of their conscious control, they're stuck?
Well, I mean, there's always been a big debate in psychology about whether psychopaths, for example, can be cured, or whether narcissists can be cured.
Mm-hmm.
And the consensus seems to be that they can't be cured because, there are almost no cases of psychopaths, showing signs of responding to treatment.
Mm.
But part of the problem is that psychopaths and narcissists never believe that there's anything wrong with them. They think that they are perfect people, so they are never willing to undergo treatment or therapy of some kind. But in practice, that may be the case. But I think in theory, at least, everybody should be able to become reconnected. Because, as I've said before, connection is our fundamental nature. It's so fundamental to us that, no matter how disconnected you are on a mental level, you are always connected at a deeper spiritual level. Yeah. So I think in theory, you should always be able to break through that shell of separation and reconnect somebody. I think, for example, I mean, there is one case, at least one case that I'm aware of, where a person who's highly disconnected to the point where he was he's in prison for murder. And this is a guy in America who'd been in prison for a number of years. And he began to spontaneously meditate. He didn't know what meditation was, but he just began to practice sort of closing his eyes and focusing on his breath, just as a way of escaping from the turmoil of the prison environment. Mm-hmm. He realized that the only way to escape it was to go inside himself. Yeah. So he began to focus on his breathing, to close his eyes and enter his own mental space every day for a few minutes, several times a day. And after a few weeks, something shifted inside him, as if a kind of wall broke down inside him, and suddenly he became capable of empathy. He started to cry for the first time ever. He felt this sense of sadness, this sense of guilt, and he sort of felt sorry for his victims and for his family. And he was never the same person after that. He became an empathic person after that. So I think meditation would be a great way of breaking down disconnection and enabling even people with psychopathic traits to reconnect.
And I suppose they haven't necessarily tried that en masse. Like these people that say that, or that you said the consensus is that you can't necessarily cure or help a psychopath to recover. I suppose that's never been trialed on a mass scale, like asking prisoners to meditate and enforcing that they do, like making sure they do. On a kind of schedule or for a significant period of time or anything like that.
Yeah, it would be a great. Thanks for the idea. It would be a great piece of research. Yeah, I mean the problem though again would be, would psychopaths be willing to sit down and meditate?
That's the question. Maybe if there was like some kind of trade-off, like if you do this for the next 5 years of your sentence, you're going to get 10% taken off your sentence, or
I guess so.
Like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it would work if people were disciplined about it. If they really did meditate,
Mm.
let's say for half an hour twice a day, I think it would have
Yeah.
it could have a healing effect on them.
Yeah, yeah, it might even have quite a shocking effect. It could help in like areas that we, other areas, side areas, and things like that. I suppose.
Yeah,
What
yeah.
external factors would you say can affect where we are on the continuum of connection? Because I like the way you do that in the book. It's a continuum. Obviously, it's not black and white. It's kind of there's a scale, and it's kind of constantly moving. It's like alive. So I'm thinking big things, small things, anything. So if you could just offer a few examples and like how that would affect, our level of connection.
I guess most of us we kind of fluctuate from day to day, maybe from year to year,
Mm-hmm.
depending on what's happening in our lives. And, I mean, one factor seems to be gender. I mean, there's evidence, there's a lot of research in
Yeah.
psychology that suggests that women tend to be slightly more empathic and more altruistic than men. So in my terminology, they would be slightly further along the continuum of connection in general.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, there may be social factors there, conditioning factors about, men are kind of conditioned to be emotionless and.
Do you think that's the main reason for it, the conditioning? Because it is strange to think of the difference. Because you'd think at the ultimate level of the level of spirit or consciousness or whatever, we're the same. I would expect, or I would at least think we are essentially the same. So yeah, do you think it's mostly the conditioning, the gender
I think
difference?
that's a factor, but I think it probably there are probably other more fundamental factors too.
Hormones.
Well, I mean, this sort of relates to a book I wrote called The Fall, which was published about 18 years ago, and the fall is basically the fall into separation, which is similar to what I'm talking about in disconnection. So my theory in that book was that women generally did not fall as severely into separation as men, into ego separation. When the fall is basically the fall into a state of extreme separateness or individuality, and when the fall occurred, men in particular began to experience a sense of duality to nature, towards their own bodies. And that's an important factor because, women are kind of more fundamentally, more powerfully connected to their biology. Female biology is a lot more kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? A lot more active or effervescent than male biology. And also maybe the fact that women in the most sort of patriarchal, the most aggressive societies, they still had a powerful role of nurturing children with a strong empathic connection to their children. Maybe that kind of made it less likely that they would become separated to the same degree as men. So maybe those factors are an influence too.
Yeah.
But in terms of what you were saying, things like mood is a big factor. If you're tired, you tend to become a slightly more selfish. If you're in a bad mood, you become a bit more self-absorbed. If you're happy, people become more empathic and more altruistic when they're happy. Age is also a factor. There's research suggesting that as people grow older, they tend to become more altruistic. In some degrees, aging seems to be a natural process of spiritual development, at least for some people. I think some people go the other way towards greater disconnection.
Get off my lawn.
Yeah, kind of young people nowadays, complaining about the world as it is now. But yeah, and spiritual development. If you follow a spiritual practice, that will increase your degree of connection.
Yeah. It's amazing to think of some of the little things, like the impact we can have on somebody else, that we can alter where they sit in that moment or on that day on the continuum of connection, just based on, maybe we cut them up while we're driving, or we beep at them unnecessarily. And then on the flip side, just a simple smile at somebody as you pass them in the street might raise where they sit at that moment. It might cheer them up, and then they pass that on to somebody else. So kind of in a way, it's almost as simple as that. Like we just need more, smiling and less like stress, and it's going to kind of gradually have that domino effect of like,
Oh, definitely. Yeah. At my university, I tell my students this story about the taxi passenger who made the whole town happy.
Right.
And it's a story of a guy arrives at a small town, gets in a taxi at the station, and starts chatting to the driver. He's very friendly and says, what do you do in your free time? Tell me about your family, blah, blah, blah. And then at the end of the journey, he says, "Wow, I felt so safe. You're a really great driver. I felt really comfortable and safe with driving with you." And the taxi driver's in a good mood. So everybody gets into his taxi. He's very friendly to them. Everybody, all of them are in a good mood too. It spreads to everybody they are in contact with. So it spreads like a kind of, like a virus. It has a contagious effect. So by the end of the day, the whole town is in a good mood just by this one taxi passenger.
Yeah.
And you're right. Yeah, it's contagious. It's just funny enough. I was just saying that to my son earlier, that we tend to remember acts of kindness, one simple act of kindness which happened 25 years ago. It stays with us. It stands out in our memory because it has such a powerful connective effect.
And the same to I would say the negative things, like a little negative comment that maybe is easy to like throw off our tongue when we're in a bad mood can stick with somebody for a lifetime.
It's so powerful. Yeah. I mean, but the great thing about altruism is that it is all about connection. When you perform an act of kindness towards somebody, a stranger or a friend or a neighbor, you connect with them. There's this powerful empathic connection. And when people witness it, there could be a stranger who's walking down the street and witnesses you being kind to another person. It spreads to them too, that they feel part of that network of connection. So, it can be really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think it's possible for hyper-connected people to occasionally, like on a one-off or occasionally, display a trait or behavior that would be normally associated with a hyper-disconnected person, and the same in reverse?
To a degree, yeah. I mean, human beings, we are variable. Our behavior fluctuates a lot. I mean, Gandhi's a good example. I use the example of Gandhi in the book. I begin the book with the interaction of Gandhi and Hitler. Gandhi famously wrote 2 letters to Hitler at the beginning and before and just at the beginning of the Second World War to try to, persuade him to halt his aggression and stop the war. But Gandhi was obviously in many ways the perfect example of an extremely connected person, somebody who felt a strong spiritual connection to his fellow human beings, who felt a mission to alleviate suffering and to stop conflict, and somebody who was willing to sacrifice his own well-being, even his own life, for principles of morality and justice. So that's the very definition of, an extremely connected person. But at the same time, Gandhi was, he was not a perfect person. At the age of 37, he decided to become celibate, but didn't tell his wife, didn't consult his wife, which is extremely selfish. When he was a young man in South Africa, he made some sort of contentious statements about, the indigenous population of South Africa. So he wasn't a perfect person. Yeah. But, it's the overall pattern of his behavior. Fundamentally, he was an extremely connected person. You could also take the example of Hitler. I mean, Hitler's servants and his domestic servants remarked that he was, was a kind person. He'd buy them presents. He was polite. He was friendly. But it's the overall general or fundamental pattern of behavior that we're talking about.
Yeah. But it is, so I guess, it is possible in the sense that we're humans, like you said, and little things here and there can go against our general character. How can we know, like, normal people that are listening to this are wondering, where do I sit on this continuum of connection? How can people know whereabouts they do fall on that, and what can we do to develop our level of connection on an individual basis? And also, kind of part B to that question, how can we develop it on a global scale?
Good question. Well, I mean, one trait which is strongly related to disconnection is the desire for wealth, power, dominance. We talked about that already, but the basic reason why there is this strong link is because when you live in a state of separation, there's always a sense of lack. There's something missing. You feel incomplete. So you feel impelled to accumulate things to compensate for your sense of lack. So you feel impelled to accumulate power, to accumulate wealth in order to kind of strengthen or reinforce yourself, to kind of compensate for your sense of lack. So I guess that is a measure of how disconnected or connected a person is. How materialistic are you? Do you feel that drive to accumulate possessions and money and power? Or are you a person who likes to live simply? Do you prefer, is time more important than money for you? Are material possessions not important to you? That's one indication. And also, we're not just talking about connections with other human beings, we're talking about connection to nature. So, if you're the kind of person who feels a strong attraction to the natural world, that's because you feel a sense of connection to nature. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people are drawn to the natural world because it enables them to transcend separateness. It enables them to reestablish a link to the world outside. And that is also one way of cultivating connection. Spending time in nature is a way of cultivating connection.
Yeah.
As acts of service are also a way of cultivating connection. Those acts of service stem from an empathic connection, a desire to alleviate a person's suffering or to help their development. But also they bring connection. The more we serve others, the more connected we become to others. So that's another way of moving towards connection. But probably the most effective way is some form of spiritual practice or some form of spiritual path. Spiritual paths are essentially paths of connection that take us beyond separation and that connect us more strongly and deeply to other beings and to the world in general.
Yeah. And in terms of those spiritual paths, what do you think is like the most effective? Is it just simply meditation because it takes so many different forms, or are there other things that you would say, this should be, one of the best ways of doing it? I'm rambling.
Well, the spiritual paths, they essentially head in the same direction, but there's a lot of variation in them, and some spiritual paths are very detailed and very methodical. So the Buddhist spiritual path, for example, is a very, the good thing about it, it's very methodical, it's very detailed, it's well mapped out. So you could just devote yourself to that particular path, if it suits you, then it would certainly be an effective way of moving towards connection. The same with the path of yoga. That's also very detailed. We're not just talking about the asanas of yoga, we're talking about the whole sort of eight-limbed path of yoga, which focuses on different aspects of human behavior and human development. And then there are other paths like the path of Sufism or the path of Christian mysticism. So they're all, anybody who devotes themselves to one particular path would certainly see, a movement towards connection. Yeah. But many people nowadays take a more eclectic approach. They practice a bit of meditation, a bit of Tai Chi, bit from here, bit from there. They sometimes call it the spiritual supermarket. But I don't think there's necessarily, people use that term, usually use it in a kind of disparaging way. But I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with it. You're picking practices which work for you, which suit your personality. But I think, to go back to your question, I think meditation is probably the prerequisite, the most essential spiritual practice, because it's effective on so many different levels.
The kind of base level, you could do so much with it, and it works in so many different areas.
Yeah, it connects you to your own deeper being, through the quietness and stillness that you develop, and it connects you to other people and to the whole cosmos in addition.
If we could convince a hyper disconnected person to read your book, Disconnected, let's give them a random name, let's say Boris or something like that. Do you think any of it would actually go in? Would they absorb any of the information? Would they read it, like actually read it? Or would it just, they glaze over it with their eyes and in one ear and out of the other kind of thing? And they wouldn't associate themselves with any of it because they can't look in the mirror and see what they are. What is your take on that? Yeah, if we could actually, because again, I know he wouldn't, they wouldn't read the book, but if they did, if we could convince them to read it, how would that go down?
I don't. They wouldn't recognize themselves because one trait of these people is that they believe that they are perfect. They believe that they are infallible, completely lacking any flaws. So they might think, oh yes, I've met a few hyper disconnected people. But it would never occur to them that they are one of them. They say, of course I feel a sense of empathy. Of course I'm a selfless person. Everything I do is selfless and for others. The one thing about them, they live in a state of self-delusion too. So, their self-delusion helps to convince them that they have no flaws and that they don't need to change.
Yeah. It's pretty wild, isn't it, to think of it like that. It's kind of
Yeah,
scary
it's
that you can kind
scary.
of, the lack of awareness. How can we help people like that are disconnected? How can we help like people with varying degrees of disconnection? How can we help them to become more connected?
Well, we've mentioned acts of kindness and altruism. I think one thing that disconnected people need is connection from others. Like it's sort of one thing they don't need is confrontation, challenge, or aggression. That just makes them more disconnected. It makes them more armored.
They don't need a taste of their own medicine. Basically, they
No,
need
no. So I try to practice that in my own life. It's not easy. I don't always succeed, but if a person is kind of nasty to me or aggressive, I try not to respond with aggression. I try to respond with sympathy, kindness, understanding, and sometimes it has the effect of breaking down their aggression. Breaking down their disconnection.
Yeah.
So we're talking again about the power of kindness. And the power of kindness works especially well against unkind people.
Yeah.
And it may take some time. You may have to, slowly work away over many weeks, but eventually you may be able to break down their disconnection.
Yeah.
And therapy, I think if you can encourage them to engage in some form of therapy, something that allows them to exchange, to communicate, to connect, because often disconnected people they live at the level of the mind, and they're very, they're very successful and very confident and competent at that level.
Mm-hmm.
And often they're not willing to go beyond the mind, to go down to the level of emotions or heart or compassion, because they operate really well at that level. That's where they live. That's where they feel comfortable. So if you can allow them or persuade them to come down from the level of mind towards the heart or towards emotions, and to engage at that level, at an emotional, empathic level, then that can be very healing for them. It's just persuading them to operate at that level.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a challenge, isn't it? Because again, I guess a lot of very disconnected people, a la Boris, we used his name. If somebody was really kind to him and helped him out, part of me thinks, probably the majority of me thinks, that he'd go home that night and be like, what a mug. Did you see Ben helping me like that? Like, what a fool, what a weak, he's never going to get anywhere in life like that. But I guess, like you said, if consistency over a period of time, maybe the kindness will break them down.
And I mean, somebody like him, I guess we are talking about Boris Johnson, the ex-prime minister. He did have a quite traumatic childhood. So if you could somehow persuade him to have therapy to deal with his childhood trauma, then or meditation, as we said earlier, if you could somehow persuade him to sit down and meditate twice a day, that could, even for somebody like him, there could be a process of reconnection.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody is completely lost. Even serial killers and psychopaths. Like I said before, connection is so fundamental that you should always be able to reconnect somebody to their essential nature.
Yeah. Do you think it's possible for, again, hypothetical situation here, do you think it's possible for a billionaire to be hyper connected? Now I say that because I feel like it's almost an oxymoron, because I feel like before you reach £1 billion, dollars, whatever, if you're that connected, you're going to have given away large sums and swathes of your money to people less fortunate or to good causes. So do you think it's possible, to be hyper connected, or at least very connected, and become a billionaire? Or is it, like I said, is it just conflicting ideas there?
It's kind of it is conflicting to a large degree. I think it could happen accidentally if somebody just invented some kind of technology which happened to become really popular and which was sold for millions of pounds or billions of pounds. But no, I think somebody who made a concerted, conscious effort to become wealthy, that could never stem from connection. Yeah. Because, as we said before, the desire for wealth is always a product of disconnection.
And I suppose in your accidental example, they would probably be a billionaire for a very short period of time, because then they'd start doing stuff with the money.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, another factor is that power and wealth do corrupt. So it's possible that a person could become accidentally wealthy and then become corrupted or disconnected.
Yeah.
You know, it's true that power corrupts. It's also true that corrupt people are attracted to power.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that. So why is politics so attractive to people that are disconnected or corrupt, or however we want to call it? And I guess to add on to that as like a part B, what is a pathocracy?
Well, politics is particularly, but it depends on the kind of society you live in. But if you live in a hierarchical society, like individualistic society like the UK or the US, then power is concentrated in certain positions. And particularly in politics, power is highly concentrated in politics, and particularly at the higher echelons of the political hierarchy.
Yeah.
So, as hyper disconnected people feel this overpowering attraction towards positions of power, they gravitate towards politics. It may depend on their kind of personality. I think particularly nowadays, people with largely narcissistic traits are particularly attracted to politics, whereas people with psychopathic traits, maybe they're not so attracted to the attention that politics brings. Maybe
basically
those people,
celebrities these days, right?
Yeah. So you got to have that instinct to that kind of desire for celebrity. I think people with more prevalent psychopathic traits more likely to operate in a kind of more secretive way. Maybe they're more likely to be HEOs or to be hardcore criminals and so forth. So yeah, I think people with kind of dominant narcissistic traits are especially attracted to the power and celebrity of politics, and also because it gives them the opportunity to gain wealth as well. So it's the ideal place for for hyper dyslexic people to gravitate to. Obviously not the only place, but one of the places.
Yeah.
And a pathocracy, that's the term for a government which consists largely or entirely of hyper disconnected or disordered people. So a pathocracy was probably the most common form of government in the 20th century. If you think about all of the large countries in the world which were governed by hyper disconnected people, like Russia, the Nazis in Germany, Spain under Franco, Mussolini, Italy, also Chairman Mao, and many other countries, South America, most of South America, certainly in the second half of the 20th century, was ruled by dictators, military dictatorships. Communist countries, which were essentially pathocracies, and then many African countries, many Middle Eastern countries in the kind of post-colonial era, which effectively became pathocracies led by sadistic, violent, incredibly brutal people like Saddam Hussein or Colonel Gaddafi. I guess are the most prominent examples. So yeah, pathocracy. And all of this comes from this incredible lust which disconnected people have for power, particularly in societies like say the Middle East that we just mentioned, or Africa, societies where there aren't strong democratic systems. Particularly in those societies, there's much more likelihood of the most ruthless, the most violent people attaining the highest positions of power, becoming presidents or prime ministers. In more democratic countries, there are more regulations to limit the behavior of these people, but they don't actually stop them getting into power in the first place. I mean, none of this stopped Boris Johnson becoming prime minister, but it did regulate his behavior, and he eventually kind of led to him leaving his position. So democracy works to a degree once these people are in power, but it doesn't stop them gaining power in the first place. I mean, another thing, one essential aspect of pathocracy is that once a disconnected or disordered leader is in place, he tends to attract other people of the same ilk with similar traits. And whereas responsible, moral people gradually leave the government, they're either resigned or they kind of leave voluntarily, or maybe even killed in some cases. So eventually, after a short space of time, the whole government consists of these types of people.
And then I guess in turn I learned this from your book, in turn that then kind of has its impact on the population, and people then, the more susceptible to influence like that, I suppose maybe not everybody, but people then generally start to become more disconnected themselves, because they have that kind of messaging coming through the media, through the government, everything like that. And so it just kind of, it's like a really vicious circle, isn't it? Where And I guess that's basically what's gone wrong with humanity since, because you made a great case in your book that for 95% of our time here, we've been connected. We've been living in, egalitarian, altruistic societies. It's only since we started to settle and our settlements became competitive and everything like that. Mm-hmm. And there we are. That's the kind of same vicious circle as to why we're here, I suppose.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the essential problems with pathocracy is that, once a pathocratic government is in place, it spreads its pathologies, or tries to at least, to the whole population, through propaganda, through influence. But also, the pathocrats, they're often very intelligent people, very cunning, very manipulative. So they know how to create a sort of sense of unity in the population. They talk about a great future, often rekindling a great past, and they talk about enemies to create a sense of unity. We've got to protect ourselves from these enemies, the dangers and so forth. So they're very adept at creating a sense of, they're very adept at spreading their pathology towards the general population.
Yeah, I guess a perfect example of that is like the way the messaging from the government in the UK and the media on like the small boats, on people refugees and people that need help coming over the channel out of pure desperation, seeking some help and some aid. Yeah. And the messaging has been on like invasion and things like that, and it's wild.
It's terrible. It's really, really awful. I don't think they do it consciously, because they are hyper disconnected people. They themselves, perceive these people as enemies. They perceive the migrants as threats to them. But maybe subconsciously they're aware that, they need to create enemies in order to entrench their power, to become more popular. There's a kind of very basic psychology there that, they know that to create otherness creates a sense of unity in a population. It's a real shame. But I mean, I do think that the good thing is that most people are generally moral and empathic. There's quite often a big disjunct between a pathocratic government and the population. Even if they try to spread their propaganda and their pathology to the general population, the majority of ordinary people are quite moral, responsible, and empathic. So sooner or later, once a government becomes especially corrupt or malevolent, the general population becomes fed up with them and eventually, moves to eject them from power, in a democracy anyway. And, if you live in Russia, or if you live in the Middle East or Africa, that may not be as easy.
Yeah. And I guess that's kind of what's happening in the UK at the moment, right? I suppose that is starting to happen. Like people that have probably been Tory voters for a long time are totally disillusioned. And I think that it's going to be a change. Obviously, we could easily go from disconnected government to disconnected government. It's not hard to imagine that happening at all. But we'll see, I guess. Boris, I tell you what, with Boris, it did, when I was reading your book, it really did feel like for a while like it was written for him, about him. Like he fits it to a T. Like he might be I don't want to say the greatest ever, because it's clearly not a good thing to be great at, but like the greatest ever narcissistic pathocrat or disconnected leader. He's obviously not in the level of Hitler or Stalin, like a psychopath in that sense, although I'm sure he has some psychopathic traits, but one of the most elite narcissist leaders ever, along with, I guess, Trump in that sense.
Yeah. I mean, they're good examples of narcissists. The only mitigating factor about narcissists is that they have a need to be liked. I mean, psychopaths just don't care. They'll kill other people, they'll manipulate, they'll persecute other people without any mitigation. But the only mitigating factor is psychopaths. They want other people to admire them, to like them. So it slightly mitigates their behavior, but
regulates them a little bit.
A little bit, yeah.
But again, Boris showed us like how he kind of grow his following, and like he has that kind of cult-like following. Again, it's kind of waning now, but for a while there, that it was insane to see people totally blind to things he would do and how he would act and things he would say. And people would make any excuse. It would be the same as how Boris would react, I suppose, if we'd asked him, like, why did you do that? And he's like, well, I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't even do that. I guess it, like you say, people kind of becoming influenced by it. How widespread is pathocracy now? I know you said last century was awful for it. Probably I think the most murderous or bloodiest century in our history.
Mm.
But how widespread is it now? Again, I think from your book, I think it's still maybe a majority of countries have like a dictator. And I know that in democracies, like we look at the UK and the US as like leading light democracies in some sense, or in some areas we think of them like that. But as far as I'm concerned, it's broken democracy. It doesn't really work.
It doesn't work. No, you're right. I mean, I think there are some promising signs in Africa, for example. You know, over the past 2-3 decades, there's definitely been a movement towards democracy and egalitarianism in Africa. You know, I think the governments are less oppressive and less pathocratic in many countries, and also in South America. You know, so there's definitely been a movement away from those military dictatorships towards more democratic governments in South America.
Yeah.
But yeah, there are some, you know, very worrying signs too in Russia. President Putin he's definitely you know, has psychopathic traits.
Yeah.
You know, the Chinese government seems to be becoming more pathocratic. So it's a mixed picture, really. I mean, I think we live in a time of extremes. We live in a time of kind of increasing connection, increasing empathy and compassion, increasing spirituality. But we also live in a time of increasing, you know, patriarchy, increasing corruption, increasing conflict. So I think we're living in interesting times. I mean, the way I would describe it is that we live in a time where, you know, the old disconnective traits of patriarchy, aggression, nationalism, warfare, and so forth, they are kind of trying to defend themselves against this rising tide of connective traits.
Yeah.
You know, so there's this kind of conflict happening between the old disconnective and the new rising connective traits.
Do you still think it's a majority at the moment of like world leaders that are disconnected and countries that have a pathocracy? Again, we don't, for the purposes of this, I mean, we can kind of throw democracies like the UK in the same bag with a very disconnected dictatorship, just for the purposes of like the UK as a political system right now is not like a connected one. It's not an altruistic one.
No.
So is it a majority of the world?
I think so. I think it's still a majority of the world. I mean, obviously there are different levels of disconnection.
Yeah.
You know, there are a lot of malevolent leaders who are not, you know, you wouldn't say they're psychopathic, but they're still disconnected to some degree. You know, they're not Hitler or Stalin, but they're still malevolent to some degree. They still have no sense of responsibility or morality. You know, and their main goal is to maintain their own power rather than to serve their own people. That's common around the world. So it is I think largely pathocracy is still the most common form of government in the world.
Yeah. Do you think there are any hyper-connected leaders, like world leaders?
Oh, I don't think so. I think there are some leaders who are connected to a degree.
Yeah.
Often we were talking earlier about gender, and I think often it tends to be the female leaders.
Yeah.
Tend to be more connected, but there are very few female leaders around the world. I think, you know, recently there were only 15 out of 170.
Yeah, that's crazy.
15 out of 190, something like that.
Yeah.
But I mean, there was some sort of. I thought Angela Merkel was a responsible, moral person who was trying to serve a population. Mm-hmm. So I don't think there are any hyper-connected leaders, but there are some leaders who are more connected than others. Put it that way.
Yeah, this is probably a fair way to put it. And what do you think we can do to avoid, or let's say minimize, pathocracy going forward?
There are a number of things, some of which are less realistic than others. I think it would be very effective to have much more regulation about who becomes a political leader.
Yeah.
One very simple idea would be to have psychological assessments at every political leader.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about filling in a checklist. I'm talking about very thorough psychological assessments, including, you know, meeting previous acquaintances, previous employees or colleagues of the person, tutors, at university. So you get a very thorough personality profile of the person.
That would, even just there, even if you didn't have anything else to say, that would change the game entirely, like on a massive scale. As long as we could guarantee that they were actually independent professionals doing those assessments.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the psychology profession is not completely free of this phenomenon either, you know. we had a whole series of issues recently in the British Psychological Society about I won't go into it, but the kind of president of the
Right.
British Psychological Society behaved in a very in an unbecoming way and had to be
Yeah.
ejected from the position. But anyway, that's one thing that could have a big impact. I mean, and it's crazy when you think about it. I mean, many professions have some form of assessment, before you're accepted.
Mm.
But we don't do it in politics. So anybody is free to put themselves forward as a political leader. Anybody
Yeah.
is free to join their local political party or association, become a councillor or become a member of parliament. Once they become a member of parliament, they're free to rise through the ranks to become prime minister. So there's no regulation at all. It's completely crazy. And that's why we end up with the situation where the British government is effectively a pathocracy.
Yeah.
Or same in the United States. The United States government, certainly under President Trump, was effectively a pathocracy because there's not enough regulation or assessment.
Yeah.
But I think there are more kind of systemic things that we can do as well. We can change the nature of democracy. I think the kind of democracy we have, it doesn't work because it's a representative democracy or an elective democracy, which means we elect people to represent us, whether they're members of parliament or congressmen or senators. But anybody is free to put themselves forward as a member of parliament or senator, and often, or in many cases, it's malevolent people, disconnected people who put themselves forward. We don't have much choice, do we elect this disconnected person or this disconnected person?
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter. But I think we need a much more participatory democracy, a much more direct form of democracy, such as, the original form of democracy in ancient Athens was very participatory. Major decisions were taken by the general population. And also in ancient Athens, there were many kind of processes which regulated power, which ensured that disreputable people did not gain positions of power. Leaders were elected by sortition, by random. Decisions were made by boards, representative citizens' assemblies representing the population. So, the good thing about this kind of system is that it would be less attractive to disconnected people. When power is more egalitarian, when it's shared or distributed, then it's no longer as attractive to disconnected people because they don't have the same opportunity to gain dominance and wealth or to manipulate other people. So there's some sort of practical things we can do. I think in a more general level and a more fundamental level, it is about personal spiritual development. The more connected we become as individuals, the more connected our societies will become, and the more connected the whole world will become.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, any of those would be a very welcome improvement on what we have right now. And in your book, I think another one was Lottocracy, where like people would randomly be, it's like kind of like jury duty, I guess, where people are assigned to work on a specific decision or project, and they'll know it's a set period of time, and they won't go back and do something again for a certain period of time. Might not be the perfect solution, but it would be, all of these things would be so far superior to the current system.
Yeah, we have a lot to learn from the earliest human societies. I mean, you mentioned earlier that that for 95% of the time we've lived on this planet, we lived in egalitarian societies or connected societies.
Yeah,
and that only really began to change once we started farming, which began about 10,000 years ago and slowly spread very, very slowly. But until then, people lived in very simple, small hunter-gatherer groups, and there are still some remaining hunter-gatherer groups who live in the same way that we did many centuries ago, many thousands of years ago. And those simple societies are very, very sophisticated mechanisms of preserving egalitarianism and harmony.
Mm-hmm.
And so they don't have a single leader who makes decisions on the behalf of the group all the time. Leadership rotates according to situations.
Yeah.
And also, people don't put themselves forward as leaders. Leaders are chosen by the whole group, sometimes at random, but usually it's the most experienced, most wise person who is chosen by the rest of the group to represent them for, in a certain situation for a certain amount of time. And those societies also they have methods of preserving the harmony of the group by limiting the influence of dominant individuals. If somebody shows a desire for dominance, they are often ostracized by the community. The whole community gangs up against them to stop them taking power.
Yeah.
So, we can learn a lot from those societies.
Absolutely. A lot indeed. And again, I guess the whole thing is about limiting how much power the leaders actually have, and how much possibility they have to accumulate and to dictate and to control things. It's about limiting that, and about making it so it's a decision made by multiple people.
Yeah, yeah. It also makes there's a strong. I mean, one of the problems in our society is that moral, responsible people are often not particularly interested in power.
Yeah,
They often don't feel comfortable with power, because power disconnects them from others. It kind of puts them on a pedestal, away from. They like to be on the ground, kind of interacting and communicating. So, if we could have some processes which ensure that the most moral, the wisest, the most empathic people take responsibility for the whole group, in a leadership position, then that would obviously improve the situation. I mean, at the moment, since moral, responsible people are not attracted to power, it leaves the positions free for immoral and irresponsible people.
Yeah. So you've come up with these, or not you personally necessarily, but you've compiled these alternatives, these potential alternatives in your book, and we've just discussed some of them now. Right. There's obviously if we sat down for hours, days, weeks, months, and thought about it in detail, there'd be lots of other ways, I'm sure, lots of potential alternatives we could come up with that would be an improvement on what we've got now. The really frustrating thing for me is, and the big question is, why are we not switching right now? Because obviously there's reasons for that. There's the people in power and things don't want it. The question is, why is there almost no sections of mainstream media that even faintly discuss an alternative system? Why is that never happening? And tonight on BBC Panorama, we talk about potential alternatives to the current political system. Why is that such a taboo almost? Why I cannot, it's like every news reporter and every journalist that's involved with these things just think, oh, well, that's what we got and that's what it will be forever, and there's no point even mentioning doing something else because, well, Boris will do something to us, or I don't know. I don't know exactly why it is, other than to think potentially that they're all kind of interlinked and there's money exchanged and it's kind of don't upset the apple cart. But what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think there are definitely vested interests, as you say, but also, as you inferred, people they take the present situation for granted. They're not aware that it can be different. They're not aware of different forms of democracy. And what frustrates me most is that nobody is aware of this connection between psychological disorders or between psychological disconnection and power. Nobody is aware that, the people in the highest positions of power in this country or in other countries, that they are psychologically disordered. People just say, oh, they're ruthless. They sometimes use adjectives to describe them. But nobody is aware of this, the psychology behind it. Maybe it's changing slightly. I mean, I've had some success in getting articles placed in the popular media. The most amazing was the Daily Telegraph contacted me and said, could you write an article about Boris Johnson and his pathological traits? So that was kind of interesting that they were happy to publish it. Yeah,
definitely. But no, it's frustrating. It's wild, but hopefully that's going to change. Hopefully you're going to get more opportunities to go and share all of this with people and to educate people in terms of that. But I suppose an element of it maybe is that people at home think, oh no, I mean, Boris can't actually have this kind of personality disorder, because surely he wouldn't have got into the position he's in if he did, right? Somebody would have stopped him. Somebody, it wouldn't have happened. It can't happen. But that's maybe, again, people don't take a moment to actually realize there are no checks and balances in place necessarily to stop
exactly
hyper disconnected people with disorders getting into these positions. God, scary times. Is there anything else you want to talk about in terms of your book before I move on and ask you some more general questions?
Maybe only that there is I am quite optimistic, despite all of the difficulties we've talked about, despite all the trouble and suffering which fills the world. I do think we are slowly moving along the continuum of connection. I think the world is becoming slowly more empathic. I think it has been becoming more empathic for the last 200 to 300 years, slowly. So I am optimistic. I think if we can survive as a species, I think we have a bright future. But the problem is that the kind of the disconnective traits are moving us towards crisis and even catastrophe.
Yeah.
I think the climate emergency is rooted in disconnection to nature.
Definitely.
So we need to move towards connection in order to ensure our survival as a species. But if we can survive, as I say, I think we do have a bright future. I think that the trajectory of history moves towards connection.
Yeah. It's that big if right now, isn't it? Like,
yeah.
So we're kind of in a race, the continuum of connection kind of increasing versus our own destruction, our own demise in terms of, as you say, environment. Obviously, we know and feel that we're on the edge of nuclear destruction at any moment. It could be today, could be in 20 years, could be in 100 years, but it feels like it's right there. And there's, other things too potentially going on that could cause us problems. But even if it's just nuclear versus an environment versus us getting connected, do you think, like, how confident are you, how optimistic are you that we're going to win that battle, that we're going to make it there and be able to fix our problems and fix our environment and everything like that?
I'm not completely confident. I guess it depends.
Hopeful.
I become sometimes I'm more pessimistic or optimistic. I think the climate emergency is possibly even worse than we think. So in that sense, I'm not particularly optimistic. Yeah. But I mean, maybe there will be time for us to recover. I think in a way, the climate emergency itself can be a spur towards awakening or increasing connection. Yeah. So we'll have to see. At the moment, I feel slightly more pessimistic than optimistic, but hopefully, I'll be proved wrong.
Yeah, at least you're still hopeful. At least you've still got that.
Yeah, I don't think it's a done deal. I think there are grounds for optimism, certainly.
Yeah. Well, that's good. So yeah, to move on then and talk about some other things. Can you kind of give me your definition of a spiritual awakening? And assuming you have had a spiritual awakening or been through a spiritual awakening yourself, could you kind of share a little bit about that?
Spiritual awakening is an expansion of awareness. Normal human awareness is quite limited, but in spiritual awakening, we suddenly experience this expansion of awareness. We become aware of more reality, both within ourselves and within the world out there. We become increasingly connected to other people. We sense other people's beings through empathy and compassion. We sense the being of the whole world, of nature, of other living beings. So there's this tremendous opening and expansion of awareness, both including within ourselves. We become aware of this amazing, rich being within our own consciousness. And yeah, I mean, I think, as we said earlier on, I had some spiritual experiences when I was quite young, when I was a teenager, probably 16 to 17 years old. So for me, it's my process of spiritual development has really been about kind of establishing wakefulness as a kind of ongoing trait, which I've tried to stabilize. In the beginning, it was a process of acceptance and understanding, and then a process of integration, trying to integrate that into my daily life so that experiences became something more stable and something more ongoing. Yeah. And obviously, it varies from day to day, but I think there is this kind of undercurrent of wakefulness which is in me all the time, which sometimes I may, become detached from, but it's always fundamentally there.
Yeah. And your spiritual experiences that you had when you were younger, were they like, what were they like? Was it just a feeling? Was it something visual? Was there more to it?
They were experiences of connection with nature, which I still get now. I get them a lot when I go into natural surroundings. But to give you one basic example, I remember when I was 16, 17 years old, walking through, I used to occasionally go back to my school at night. It's probably the only person who used to go back to school at night, just to wander around the fields, because I lived in the city. There weren't many natural spaces. So I just like to go back to the fields and wander around on my own, because I knew I would be undisturbed, and I like to enjoy the stillness and solitude. So I remember walking through my school fields at night in the darkness and just being aware that the trees were sentient beings. They were living beings with their own kind of consciousness. Then I looked at the sky. The sky seemed to be alive with its own kind of consciousness. Everything around me was alive. The moon, the clouds, everything seemed to have its own kind of sentience or being. And I felt that everything was interconnected. everything was kind of like the manifestation of something more fundamental, as if all of these different phenomena were expressions, like waves of the same ocean.
Yeah.
And I felt like I was part of it too. There was no sense of separation. I was part of this powerful network of being. And there was a feeling of kind of elation, a feeling of harmony and meaning.
Yeah. Wow. That must have been amazing. And I guess, like you said, at the time, you didn't really realize what was happening. You didn't really know it was a spiritual experience. You didn't know those words to put on it. It was just an experience, I guess, for you, just something that you felt.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't tell other people about it. I didn't try to describe it to other people because I sensed that they would think I was a bit crazy. So
Yeah.
I just kept it to myself. I mean, I thought there was probably something slightly wrong with me, like I said earlier, that I was slightly crazy, like I thought I was like a bit like a kind of crazy romantic poet. I had that kind of image about myself.
Yeah. How and why does trauma open people up to these kind of experiences and to spiritual awakening?
That's a good question. Trauma is, it's one way in which the ego can become deconstructed.
Mm-hmm.
When people go through intensely traumatic experiences, in some cases, probably, in a small number of cases overall, the ego breaks down. It can't stand the pressure of the situation, or slowly it's dismantled over a long period as a person's psychological attachments are taken away. And eventually they reach a point where the ego just dissolves or collapses, like a house that collapses in an earthquake, or a house that collapses when you take all of the bricks away.
Yeah.
And often that's just equivalent to a breakdown, even psychosis. But in some people, it may also be equivalent, or it may also enable a transformation to take place. It may enable a new self to be born inside them. So some people, it's almost as if they have a dormant or latent spiritually awakened self, which is just kind of waiting for the opportunity to arise, like a phoenix that arises from the ashes. So when the ego breaks down, that's when the new spiritually awakened self arises.
Or the old spiritually awakened self, the innate spiritually awakened self.
Yeah, that's right. It was always there. It was already sort of established as a structure, but it didn't have the opportunity to manifest itself until the normal ego died away.
Yeah, and that can happen regardless of whether it's like a sudden trauma that doesn't like a bereavement or something, or like a period of depression or what have you. It
can happen in a kind of a variety of different scenarios. I mean, bereavement is a good example because it does often happen following a bereavement. I mean, bereavement breaks everything down. The normal world is turned upside down. Everything that we depended on for our security and well-being is stripped away.
Yeah.
It can also happen through addiction. I mean, the addiction is kind of a classic case, really, because slowly over the course of an addiction, everything is taken away. A person loses their friends, their career, their self-respect. They may even come close to losing their life. And eventually, when they've lost everything, that's when this transformation can occur. So there are many strange cases of, which I talk about in my book, Extraordinary Awakenings, many strange cases of people who, they've been really severe addicts for a long period of time, and they reach the point of desolation. Sometimes they reach the point of attempting suicide. And then they undergo this seemingly miraculous transformation where their addiction fades away, just falls away.
Yeah.
And they become free of addiction in an almost miraculous way.
It's kind of beautiful, like the trauma and these difficult experiences can act as a catalyst for the exact thing that we require at that moment to have the life altered.
It often happens with an encounter with death. When a person is diagnosed with cancer, or they recover from a life-threatening emergency. They become literally different people in the aftermath.
Yeah, I always remember when I was a kid, I think one of the teachers at my school, he was like, had a reputation for just being horrible, just not being a nice guy at all. Although he did, he had a little side to him, maybe like a diamond has many sides. One of his sides was okay, but generally rough and not very nice. Anyway, he was diagnosed with, I don't know what form of cancer, but some type of cancer. And I think he didn't die from that, I don't think, or at least not in a period of a few years from that point. But next time kind of I interacted with him, he was a totally different person, like came across really like interested in me and was, like a nice guy. And people were saying like, oh, have you seen Mr. Whatever? And like, yeah, wow, he's changed. He's a really nice guy and all this kind of thing. And so it's cool to see it on an individual basis.
Yeah. I often think that every human being should have an encounter with death just to wake them up and, shift them into a more connected state.
Yeah. Yeah. You recently sat down with Zak Khan.
Oh yeah.
And so when you sat down with him, I think like 2 months ago now, maybe 2 or 3 months ago, he only had a few weeks to live. You recorded that conversation at his request, and I think you described the conversation as maybe the most profound conversation you've ever had. You've published them on your podcast, which I've listened to the first 2 parts of them, and I recommend anybody that's interested to go and listen to that. But I just wondered, if you could kind of talk a little bit about Zak and I mean, first of all, can you just introduce Zak before I kind of ask my first question about that, I guess, like who was he?
A friend of mine put me in contact with Zak when I was writing my book, Extraordinary Awakenings, because she knew that he had a major transformation as a result of being ill with cancer. So he had a powerful near-death experience. And it was the type of near-death experience where he left his body and he traveled through space and he felt this kind of incandescent light around him. He met beings who sort of shared their wisdom with him. It was this amazing transformational journey, which probably only lasted a few seconds in real time, but for him, it seemed to last for hours.
Yeah. And
that was when he almost died due to complications from his cancer treatment when he was in hospital. I think that was in 2009. So after that experience, he was a changed person. For one thing, he knew that there was some form of life after death. He knew that his consciousness would continue once his body dissolved away. And he had this sense that, the fundamental reality of the universe was bliss or love. In his near-death experience, he just sensed this pure love and light. He sensed this light that he felt was the source of the universe, which many people do in near-death experiences. So he was a different person. So I interviewed him about that experience and how it had transformed his life. And then I became quite friendly with him. He started to do a PhD with me at my university.
Okay, yeah.
He was interested he had a background in psychology and wanted to do a PhD on spiritual psychology. But soon afterwards, or a few months afterwards, his cancer returned, and he was told that he could have treatment, and if he didn't have treatment, he probably just had maybe 3 months left to live. But the treatment was only, I think he said it had a 20 to 50% chance of success, which is a fairly decent chance of success. But he decided not to have the treatment. He decided that he wasn't going to put himself through it. He decided that he was going to accept the fact that he was going to die, and just savor his last few weeks of life on this planet. And we got together and I interviewed him about how he was feeling and why he decided to face death rather than have treatment.
Yeah.
And he died just about 2 weeks after the interview. So it was a very profound experience to sit with somebody who had chosen to embrace his own demise. I mean, I think part of the reason why he was willing to do that was because he knew from his previous experience, he was convinced that there was some form of continuation.
Yeah, he had no fear.
He had no fear.
What was his approach and his attitude towards the impending death of his body? Like, how was he dealing with that? How was he processing it?
He was in a state of surrender. He was in a state of bliss. It was really fantastic to spend time with. I could feel radiance around him. He was in a complete state of serenity, which may seem paradoxical to people who naturally, fear death or want to postpone death for as long as possible. That's completely normal and natural. But it was quite remarkable to find how serene and how radiant he was.
What can we learn from him, do you think? What can everybody listening take from how Zak approached all that and dealt with all that?
Well, I learned two things. He said that there were two kind of messages that he wanted to share with people. The first one was that the importance of kindness. He said that when he looked back over his life, the most important aspect was kindness, the kindness that he'd received and the kindness that he had given. So he talked a lot about living from the heart, and that when you die, all that remains is what's in your heart. All that remains is the kindness that you've shown or received. And he felt that would determine your experience or his experience after death, what remained in his heart, the benevolence that he felt. And that was one thing that's very important. He also talks about the importance of experience, about not procrastinating. He said that human beings just waste so much time. We forget that time is a limited resource, and that we just procrastinate and waste time doing trivial things, talking about trivial things. So he was really aware of the importance of utilizing the limited time we have to gain experiences and to do positive things in the world.
Yeah.
So that's what's remained with me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good advice. What would you say is the most profound thing that he said, or the most memorable? Was it the stuff that you just said, or was there something else?
I think for me, the most profound thing, it wasn't so much what he said, it was his attitude. It was his attitude of acceptance and surrender. It was so profound that, we live in a culture which denies death and which tries to postpone or even tries to repress or eliminate death.
Yeah.
But he was somebody who just entirely accepted the fact that death is real, death will happen, it will come to us all. It came to him sooner than other people, maybe sooner than even he would have liked, but we're all going to be in the same position at some point. We all have to face death at some point. We all have to ideally face it with acceptance and serenity, as Zak did.
Yeah. But again, such a powerful conversation. Have you experienced any kind of after death communication or anything at all from Zak since he transitioned? Have you felt anything?
I haven't. No. I've had one or two experiences in other contexts, but not with Zak.
Yeah. Would you be okay to share one of your other experiences in terms of after death communication?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of I've done some research on after death communications. So I used to be skeptical about the idea of life after death.
Me too.
I was, until a few years ago, I was skeptical until I started looking at the evidence and the research.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was always open to the idea that that there was something kind of essential, some kind of spiritual essence within me that would survive, but not my personality or identity. But now I think it's very likely that personal identity does survive death, just purely based on evidence, And I've had some experiences. For example, not long after my grandfather died, it was probably a few months after he died. I saw him in a dream, and it was so vivid that it wasn't just a hallucinatory dream. It sort of conveyed a powerful sense of reality. And I sort of had a chat with him in my dream. It was quite trivial, My grandfather was he was a real ladies' man. He had always had 2 or 3 girlfriends at the same time. So I said to him, "Oh, how are you? What's it like, in the afterworld?" And he said, "Yeah, it's I'm enjoying myself. I've got 2 girlfriends at the moment," and it seems trivial, but it was so kind of real and so powerful that I was definitely left with the sense that he was still extant. He was still conscious in some sort of different form or different level of reality.
Yeah. Wow. Unfortunately, I haven't had any kind of definitive experiences that I can hold on to. But like you said, it's once I started doing the research, my opinions on the whole matter started to shift. For the rest of our time, I think I'm going to have to kind of wear for the steam through questions a little bit, because I got quite a few I want to get to, and we'll just kind of see how many we can do in our remaining time. So a bit of kind of quick fire, even though most of them are going to be the kind of questions that we could discuss for like an hour, if we had the time. What does your theory, your book, your theory about connection tell us about organized religion?
Yeah, I mean, my attitude to organized religion is quite negative. I think it's quite, it's in some ways it's based on disconnection. I mean, I think any ideology involves disconnection. Ideology, creates a kind of abstraction. It's a kind of like belief systems are conceptual, abstract conceptual systems which separate us from reality. We perceive reality through the filter of our belief systems. So it's the best thing is to do away with any belief system and just try to perceive reality in a more raw and unfiltered way.
Yeah. I guess one way to convince a religious person to do that, or somebody that follows organized religion, would be to say that if your religion is true and the right thing, then you're going to come back to that naturally once you strip away your allegiances and you begin to explore. You're gonna reconnect with it anyway if it's the true source or whatever. What about your thoughts in brief on consciousness? You've kind of alluded to the fact already that you're pretty convinced that it's fundamental. It's like in everything. Is there anything else you want to say about it? Yeah, just in a nutshell.
Yeah, you could say that consciousness is the fundamental ground reality of the universe, and our own consciousness is an influx of the consciousness of the universe. So I don't think many people assume that the brain produces consciousness, but I don't think it does. I think that consciousness flows through the brain. I think the brain is a kind of receiver and transmitter of consciousness. And the primary purpose of the brain is to pick up consciousness and allow it to enter our own being. And that's why, so many mystics or so many spiritual experiences report that feeling of unity, the feeling that your own consciousness partakes in the consciousness of something more fundamental, that you are one with the universe. So, I mean, that is a basic fact, that our own consciousness is one with the consciousness of the universe.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, in that sense, of course, all plants, all animals, everything has consciousness within it. But what are your thoughts on conscious experience of animals and trees and plants and things like that? Like, do you think there are varying levels of conscious experience?
Definitely. Yeah, I think it depends on the complexity, the physical complexity of any living being.
Yeah, the receiver.
There's a correlation. Yeah, how complex the receiver is. I mean, obviously, the human brain is the most complex organ or object in the universe. I mean, there are other animals with highly complex brains too, like dolphins or whales. So they are probably extremely intensely conscious too. But then you have less physically complex animals or beings, so insects or worms. So they probably have a lower level of consciousness simply because their receiver does not, allow them to experience an intense consciousness.
What about your thoughts in brief on psi phenomena?
I'm very open to psi phenomena. Again, it's based on research. Many people are closed-minded about psi phenomena, but I think there's so much evidence.
To be very much.
Sorry?
I used to be very much closed-minded to it. Again, like we said earlier, before I started looking at the evidence.
Yeah, the evidence is pretty convincing. I mean, unfortunately, psi phenomena don't work so well in laboratory situations. They're a bit like, I think of psi phenomena as a bit like poetry. You can't put a poet in a laboratory and say, okay, write a poem now. Yeah, you may try to, but it will probably be a pretty poor poem. But, the kind of abilities which are unusual and which arise in certain situations spontaneously, like creativity arises spontaneously. So you've got to be in the right mood. You've got to be in a relaxed frame of mind in order to manifest psi abilities, which you're not when you're in a laboratory. But even so, laboratory experiments do show kind of, some significant results.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the anecdotal evidence is incredibly strong too. There are so many well-attested cases of psi phenomena, precognition, telepathy, which are also evidential, even though they're not laboratory experiments.
Yeah. And I guess with the laboratory experiments, even though it shows like a small, maybe a low kind of strength of ability, it shows, I think, a pretty consistent thing there, a pretty consistent ground level, like base level of it, which I think is significant. I think it's essentially proven now, even though it's totally not accepted by the wider community and most scientists. But I think it is essentially proven, really, if the evidence is there.
The effects have been so consistent over so many years, in the most stringent laboratory situations. So I agree with you. I think it's basically been proven.
And how would you define deep empathy? This is something that was mentioned in your book, Disconnected, and I just wanted you to quickly give a definition of deep empathy. And I wonder whether it could be, in essence, another form of psi phenomena, whether we could kind of bundle it in with that in a way.
Good point. Yeah, it could even be seen as a kind of spiritual experience. Yeah, but deep empathy, empathy is often seen as a kind of cognitive ability, the ability to put yourself in someone's shoes, to see the world from their perspective. Anybody can do that. A psychopath can do that. You can sort of try to imagine what another person may be experiencing. But deep empathy is much more profound. It's actually sensing, feeling the experiences of another person. It's actually sharing their mental space, sharing their identity even. And it's quite normal. It's quite routine experiencing. People sometimes say that autistic people are not capable of empathy. But I think autistic people often find it difficult to kind of imagine, take other people's perspective in that kind of, in terms of cognitive empathy. But they are certainly able to feel deep empathy. That's quite common for autistic people.
Yeah. Have you, other than the ones you've already kind of spoken about, like your spiritual experiences when you were younger, have you had any other extraordinary or anomalous experiences that what am I trying to say? Just have you had any other anomalous or extraordinary experiences? Things like, an extraordinary UFO sighting or other after-death communications, a near-death experience, out-of-body experience, precognitive dream, all these, anything along these lines, an evidential reading from a medium, anything like these?
I've had precognitive dreams, but like a lot of precognitive dreams, precognition is quite weird because it either seems to be relating to something incredibly important, like some kind of disaster or some major crisis, or something incredibly trivial. So my precognitive dreams tend to be incredibly trivial. And they tend to be based on sport for some bizarre reason. So I've had bizarre dreams where I've predicted the scores of football matches.
Really?
There was a football match about 20 years ago when England beat Germany 5-0. Which was like the first time Germany had been beaten for many years, and the first time in England had beat them by more than one goal for decades or something. But anyway, I had a dream about the match. I'd arranged to go and watch it at my friend's house, and the night before I had a dream, and in my dream we were watching the TV, and the score said England 4, Germany 0. I thought, wow. Anyway, I told my friend about it, and he said, "Oh, you're joking. That can't happen." But anyway, then we were watching the match, and then I saw England 4, Germany 0. I thought, wow, this is my dream. So, I had a couple of dreams like that. On one occasion, I tried to put a bet on it because I was...
I was going to say, tell me next time.
Yeah. But anyway, it's a long story, but I couldn't put a bet on it in the end. But I've had trivial precognitive experiences like that. I've had some very powerful spiritual experiences when I felt as though I've left my body and fused with a kind of a fundamental harmony or a fundamental bliss of the universe. Once I mentioned before, I used to be a musician.
Yeah.
And like a lot of musicians, I lived a quite kind of hedonistic life, lots of drinking and smoking. And I kind of went astray for a few years and forgot about spirituality and got immersed in that kind of lifestyle in my 20s. But one night, I think we'd had a gig with my band and we sort of got drunk as usual and got to bed about 4 a.m. And I just woke up a couple of hours later in the darkness and I was completely sober and completely clear. And it was the most blissful experience I'd ever had. I felt like I was just sort of floating through space. I was completely conscious. It wasn't a hallucination. I was completely, incredibly clearly conscious. But I felt this kind of oneness with the whole universe. I felt as though I was kind of floating on this waves of bliss. And I knew that this was the fundamental reality of the universe, that harmony and bliss was the essence of reality. And it was such a kind of liberating, reassuring experience that it kind of stayed with me for days. I felt I was like floating on air for days afterwards. And
wow.
And it faded away for a while. But I think what it was kind of like it was calling me back towards that kind of spiritual side of my being, which had become alienated from.
Yeah.
So my life began to sort of reorientate itself back towards spirituality after that.
Yeah. Wow. You said, you can probably hear my dog barking in the background. I don't know what he's going on about. You said during that you tried to put a bet on, but you couldn't. Do you remember if on that occasion the score came in? Like, was it as you predicted, as your dream predicted?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. That was this was when many years ago I used to work at a football ground selling fanzines for my brother.
Yeah.
Manchester United. We used to work at the Manchester United's ground. And I had a dream the night before the match. I think Manchester United were playing Arsenal, and I had a dream that Manchester United it would be 0-0, but Manchester United would get a penalty in injury time and they would win 1-0. And this guy, Ruud van Nistelrooy, the player, would score the penalty. Yeah. But anyway, we were there selling the fanzines. And it happened exactly as my dream predicted. I told all my colleagues about it, my fellow magazine sellers. So they were calling me Psychic Steve. But anyway, I did go to the betting shop and tried to put a bet on, but the guy said, no, this was a different era, before betting was as prevalent as it is now. They said, no, we can't put bets on penalties about whether I want to bet that there will be a penalty in injury time. He said, no, we can't do that. We just bet on scores. So I didn't in the end.
Nowadays, you could go into the shop and probably put it on the specific player to score at the specific minute and everything like that.
Yeah, it was more difficult in those days.
Yeah, well, you'll have to let me know if you have another score predicting dream. And I'll put a little bet on. Just a real quick question. It's just I was thinking about it while you were answering that. It just popped into my head. Are you able to lucid dream at will? Is that something you do, or?
No, I mean, I've had a couple of lucid dreams, but not at will. I know people who have learned to cultivate it, but I've not. Yeah, I've not tried that yet. Have you? Are you able to do that?
I had one lucid dream. I definitely can't do it at will. I've spoken to Robert Wagner, who's written a few books on it, and I've spoken to him twice now. I had one after I spoke to him the first time, but I haven't really committed to doing the techniques and stuff to try and induce it. So I do want to try and do that more, because it does seems incredible. He meditates in his lucid dreams and all sorts, and has like deep spiritual experiences in his lucid dream.
Oh wow!
It's pretty wild stuff, actually. It seems like there's a whole Pandora's box there that could be, untapped potential there of stuff we can do, and it's not even like, I'm too busy to lucid dream because I'm just asleep, right? So I just need to figure out how to be able to do it on command. I guess the last question I'm going to ask you before I just ask you for a few words, a message to round us out, is just going to be based on, so I'll kind of lead up to it. So you've written plenty of brilliant articles for Psychology Today, and what's the other magazine you write for, or website you write for? What's
The Conversation?
Yeah, I guess The Conversation, Psychology Today, and maybe there's another one as well. But anyway, yeah.
So sometimes for Scientific American?
Scientific American, I guess. Yeah, that's the one that was on my mind.
Yeah, I've written articles for Scientific American,
Yeah. So you've written some brilliant articles about matters pertaining to death and survival after death. You obviously wrote your essay for the Bigelow Institute of Consciousness Studies, which received an honorable mention. So you know quite a lot bit about this, and your conclusion is clearly survival. You mentioned earlier that you do think we retain at least some level of personality. Can you give more information in terms of what you think happens after we die? What exactly do we retain? What is that process like in your? Again, I know we're in speculation land, but what are your thoughts on that?
It's quite difficult to describe, but it seems as though we do retain many of our personality traits, but it seems as though life, or the next life, is different in some fundamental ways. It seems to be lighter in some way, more subtle. I mean, many spiritual traditions or esoteric traditions talk about a subtle body. And it does seem to be the case that once we lose this kind of dense physical body, there is some kind of subtle body, astral body, that some people use that term, which survives. And Zak used to say this. Zak said, based on his experience, that life in the next dimension would be easier. This level of existence is quite dense, and it involves a lot of suffering. So I think that's one reason why Zak was so happy to go, because he knew that the next life would involve less suffering. It would be lighter, freer, in this kind of more subtle dimension. Yeah. So I think, it's difficult to say exactly what will happen, but I'm sure that life will be easier and sort of lighter, maybe more naturally spiritual.
Yeah. Yeah. And hopefully, yeah, like you say, less suffering. Do you put any weight into the idea of karma? Do you think that is something that happens in reality? Obviously, again, I know we don't know. You don't, I'm not coming to you as, oh, Steve, give me the true answers here. But what are your thoughts on that, like karma?
I'm not sure really. I know that many people who have near-death experiences, they say that they become aware of every single negative behavior they've enacted. Mm-hmm. They really feel it as a strong kind of force, the negativity of it, whereas they feel the energy of the positive actions that they've created. And again, Zak mentioned that. He mentioned that when you die, all that matters is what's in your heart, whether it's benevolence or kindness. So in that sense, I think it may have an effect, but I'm not sure whether there is a direct connection between our previous actions and the actions that occur, or the kind of...
I see what you're saying. It could influence it in some naturalistic fashion, but it's not... Yeah, there's nobody like looking at scorecards and stuff like that.
I don't think there's a direct causal connection.
No. And I guess one thing that kind of... It kind of aligns with what you just mentioned about Zak saying in terms of taking what's in our heart, is like in some of the cases of reincarnation that they've looked into at the Division of Perceptual Studies, like it seems like sometimes negative emotions can carry over too. Like, you can take anger with you or a grudge and things like that, which kind of goes against like a popular, the popular way of thinking of that it's all blissful and it's all good and there's no negative.
Yeah.
I don't really know what to do with that thought. Other than just it must be some kind of naturalistic process, whichever way it goes.
Yeah, I think in some ways life after death may not be so different from this life, apart from the fact that it may be more kind of subtle and lighter with less suffering. But I mean, many indigenous groups take life after death for granted, but they don't see it as a kind of paradise or heaven. They see it as a fairly mundane affair. That they think their ancestors are living all around them in a different dimension.
Yeah,
living in a similar way, in a different realm.
Yeah. I should have given you a heads up, and I should have tried to we could have like rounded it out with you doing a little meditation, but I haven't given you any warning. We probably haven't really got time left anyway, but maybe in the future. And if anybody does want to, listen to a guided meditation that you've done, check out Steve's podcast, The Clear Light. I'll put the link in the description of this, along with your books and everything like that. But look, are there any kind of last words, a message you want to leave with people that have watched and listened?
Only that, I think we all have responsibility, in relation to the human race's future, not just in terms of our direct behavior, but also in terms of our own personal development. I really do think that we are all interconnected on a fundamental level. So how, the development that we undergo as individuals contributes to the development of our species. So as we become individually more connected, more empathic, more spiritual, more compassionate, that helps a whole species to move in that direction too. So, without wishing to put pressure on people, I do think, we do carry this responsibility and power as well, this power to create change in the collective consciousness of the human race.
Absolutely. And people need to feel like, their small little one person can make a difference, right?
Yeah, the biggest fallacy is that we are individuals. We're not individuals. We're all interconnected and we influence the whole.
Yeah, and like we said earlier, a smile spreads. So just something little, and it can snowball from there. Thank you so much for this today, Steve. I really appreciate you giving me your time, and I've really enjoyed talking to you. Your book again, DisConnected, brilliant book. I hope everybody will read it. The link will be in the description. Yeah, much appreciated, and I wish you all my best.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to my conversation with Steve Taylor. I hope you enjoyed it and resonated with it. Please see the description for relevant links, including to Steve's latest book, DisConnected. If you're enjoying our channel, please subscribe to continue unraveling the universe with us. And if you want to help us keep making content, please consider contributing a small amount via Patreon. Thank you.